Award-winning metalware, home accessories, and fine jewelry designer Michael Aram is visiting Toronto's Dana Jordan at the Bayview Village Shopping Centre. And we took this opportunity to come and have this interview with him. Hi, Michael.
Hello, how are you, Susie?
Good, how are you?
Very good. Very happy to be here.
This is such an amazing day for us. We're going to have this interview, and we were looking forward to have this interview with you. And I love your creations. They're really creations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now, I see a lot of Armenian designs in them, and the Armenian culture is obvious in them. How did your Armenian roots influence your artwork?
You know, I always say that as an artist, it's very important that your inspiration and your influences come from very deep inside of you. And you know, I've always been someone who designs things and creates things that have personal meaning for me. You know, when I was a little child, I remember crawling around on our Armenian carpets and looking at our tree of life motifs, our pomegranate motifs, all of our natural dyes. And I think, you know, all of our experiences growing up, you know, my parents were great entertainers and loved to set a beautiful table like many Armenian families. They loved having people over. You know, these were influences in my life which I know have greatly influenced my work and even why I choose to design objects that are used and celebrated. You know, I always say that our most important memories are created around the table. You know, I remember dinners at my grandparents' house, conversations growing up, family dinners on Sunday, how important all of that was and how for me, even the memory of what was on the table was so important. Remembering, you know, the spoon my grandmother stirred her pilav with, and you know, like just these things become transmitters of memory for us, and they really create a sense of family values and family collective memory. So you know, all of those influences have been very important. I also grew up, you know, going to Armenian church and was very struck by the ceremony and the ritual and the objects, you know, and these are things which certainly have influenced my work.
It's interesting that you chose to work with metals where you're so multi-talented and you could have used so many other objects or materials. Why metal?
You know, I always loved the fact that very spontaneous gestures can be captured in metal and in a way frozen for time. You know, there's almost a contrast between the permanence of metal and the ability to catch something that's very spontaneous. I work with my hands, I sculpt myself, and I always say that you can even see the fingerprints in the metal. You know, as an artist growing up and living in New York, it was very hard for me to work in materials other than paint and drawing and, you know, whatever I could do in an urban environment. When I went to India at age 25, I discovered all these incredible craftsmen who were working on the roadside in metal and making these, you know, incredibly complicated, beautiful objects, but things that were for everyday life. You know, I saw craftsmen who were making buckets and shovels and scissors and, you know, really ordinary objects, but they were making them, from my perspective as a fine artist, they were making them in the most extraordinary way. So at that point I got very inspired to work with these craftspeople, and because they were doing work that was functional objects, it inspired me to make decorative objects using all the skills, all the beautiful crafts that they were using to create the objects, but to sort of infuse it with my artist eye. So it was really what I call the meeting of artist and artisan to create objects which were one of a kind, handmade, very special, but also had an artistic intent, you know. And that's really key. You know, I always tell my customers, you know, I create objects which I hope are celebrated. I always say, please use them, please abuse them, please make them part of your everyday ritual, make them part of your dinners, make them part of your, you know, put fruit in them. You know, it's not exciting for me, and people say, oh, I love your pieces, I keep them in my cabinet and I look at them. No, please use them. You know, I want kids to touch them and, you know, people to interact with them. That's what for me gives the greatest pleasure.
Now, Michael, you have had a very busy year in 2015, 16, and this year. So let's go back a couple of years ago. And 2015, you were invited by the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church of America to create a special sculpture for the centennial of the Armenian genocide. Can you talk about that?
I can talk about it. I do get emotional still when I talk about it. You know, I was very keen to create something to honor the centennial. And I was very blessed to have had the opportunity to create the sculpture on the plaza of the cathedral in New York City, which is a church that we go to with our family and is very much part of my life in New York. So it was an incredible honor. And when thinking about what to create, I had a lot of thoughts in my head, but the piece came to me very, very quickly. People say, "Well, how long did it take you to come up with the idea?" It was almost like it was there. I remember when I first went to Armenia in 1981, so many years ago. I was so struck by the Armenian church architecture, but particularly the khachkars, which I think are so uniquely Armenian and so much a part of our Armenian artistic heritage, And there was something really, sort of like monumental in my head about that shape. It's this monolithic shape of the khachkars, and it holds such a important symbolic meaning for us. Even when you think of, khachkars that are now in Turkey and how they're being destroyed, and like the idea of holding on to our cultural legacy is so important. Even in New York City, I always take my kids to the Metropolitan Museum, and we have a khachkar there, and I always, take a picture with them in front of the khachkar and take such a sense of pride from it. So I love the idea of the shape of the migration sculpture, inspired by the Armenian khachkar. But in my piece, the khachkar is cracked from the top, with the idea that something's broken. That sort of important symbol for us is cracked and will never be the same. But the crack is in the shape of historic Armenia, historic settlements of where Armenian populations lived before 1915. So it has a very, very symbolic shape. But what I did is I took the map and then, turned it on its side with the idea of upheaval, with the idea of displacement, and with the idea that, thousands of people had to flee their homeland, that their lives were turned upside down, And then out of the crack fly hundreds and hundreds of birds. Birds have always been a symbol of the genocide. I think of the birds as symbols of deliverance, symbols of salvation. And while I was creating the piece in my studio, I hadn't told my team what the piece was. I think even for myself, I was still formulating my words and my thoughts about the piece. I hadn't explained to my team what we were making, but there I was, placing the birds, sculpting the birds. And one of my studio craftsmen in India had said to me, he said, "We have to make sure the piece has a positive meaning."
Yes.
And I hadn't even explained to him the pain, the displacement, the suffering, the symbolism, and what it meant for me. But he could see how I was reacting while I was creating the piece, and felt that in me and said, "We have to make sure the piece is positive." And at that point, my whole brain pivoted, and I said, "No, I have to call it migrations." Because, when birds migrate, they go to a new home, and then they come back also, and they come back, And I think now, after the centennial, or during the centennial, so much of us felt that sense of going back, and revisiting, not only revisiting the events, but revisiting Armenia, And it's about sort of, birds that return back home, And I think there's something really forward-thinking about it. I also created the piece in high-polished stainless steel, with the idea that when you look in the piece, you don't only see the history, or at least my expression of the history, but you see yourself. And you see yourself as proof of our survival, And I think that that's really the point that is validating, I have young children, they're 6.5 years old now, and I always thought, how will I talk to them about the genocide? I don't want them to harbor the same kind of unspoken pain that I grew up with my grandparents, who could never talk about it until they were very old, But you always sense the sense of sadness. You always sense this, fear even in them still about going back or going to Turkey or what it was for them. I remember them saying, don't talk about it to each other if one of them started to tell us about what had happened to them in their lives. So, I thought that for me to be able to look at the sculpture and say to my kids, look at the sculpture, look at you, look at your reflection, and look at the journey that our forefathers took to get us here. Look at what they did to endure and survive, and that we are the reflection of their journey. So yes, it was a very clearly it was a very emotional.
Վարձկտ կդար Michael, it's a beautiful piece եւ երկար դարիներ պիտի մնա. Now, in 2016, you were asked by the government of Armenia this time to create another masterpiece for Pope Francis, and you came up with Noah's Ark. And this piece is installed in the Vatican permanently. Can we talk about that?
Of course. Certainly it was a very surreal moment, I'll say, when I picked up the phone in the office. And it was, a very senior person in the government who was saying that he wanted me to create this piece. And it was very funny because, of course, the way things happen in life, we didn't have much time. It was a very quick project for me. I didn't have the year to plan it, or even I think 3 months to plan it. It was a very short project that had to happen. But I said that I would think about it and get back to him the next day. And after I put the phone down, I called him back in 5 minutes and I said, of course I have to do it. No matter what, I'll do it, And it was such an honor to create the piece, which was the center of the ecumenical service with Pope Francis in Yerevan, where there were over 70,000 people there for the service. And the idea was for Pope Francis that this was not just a visit to Armenia. This was a pilgrimage to the land of Noah, a pilgrimage to the birth of Christianity, to the first Christian country. And so thinking about all of that, and also understanding that Pope Francis wanted to meet with refugee children in Armenia from different parts of the world who've now found a safe home in Armenia. The idea came about to create a piece that told the story of our early Christian faith, of Armenia as really the cradle of civilization, and to use the Ararat mountain as not only the symbol of Armenia, at least in our hearts and minds and our identity, but also to tell the story of our early beginnings of the land of Noah. So I chose to depict the Noah's Ark on Ararat, and at the top of the ark had a dove with an olive branch, of course symbolizing the first sign of life with the dove.
And my last question, what are your future plans? You come up with so many new ideas every time I see you.
That's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that. I will say that I love my work. I'm passionate about what I do. And, I just hope that I'll be able to continue to follow my passions and my dreams for many years. One of our new projects has been our jewelry collection. And it's something that's giving me a tremendous amount of pleasure now, to work in a material that's more precious, to work at a scale that's even smaller, and to create pieces I think that are even more personal. I always say that there's no better gift in metal than a piece of jewelry. And as someone who's dedicated his entire life's work to metal-based craft designs, to be able to do jewelry is sort of like the ultimate expression, and for people to really treasure them, to wear them close to their body, the pieces almost become part of them, and also get passed down for generations. They really carry so much symbolism, so much meaning, and I hope that my expressions in jewelry will hopefully reach as many of our customers as our objects for the home have. So thank you so much.
Michael, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to have this interview with you, and all the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susie.